Well, hey guys, Pastor Jason here, one of the pastors at North Park Church here in Columbus, Nebraska, and I am very grateful to once again be bringing your life group lesson to you for the week. And we are still in our Fearless series, obviously, Fearless, still behind me, and we are on week 13 of this series, and we're talking about Joshua leading the Israelites into the land that God had promised them, into the promised land, and pulling some great stuff about fear as it pertains to us and us dealing with it out of this story. And this week in the story, just briefly where we are at, they have made it across the Jordan and into the promised land, and they're camped out inside of the enemy, the Israelites are, and that's where we're at in our story right now. So this week, we're in Joshua 5 still, verses 10 through 12. I'm going to go ahead and read those verses right now. You guys follow along on your outlines here, follow along in your Bibles, and then we will jump right into some discussion questions. So Joshua 5, verses 10, 11, and 12. While the people of Israel were encamped at Gilgal, they kept the Passover on the 14th day of the month in the evening on the plains of Jericho. And the day after the Passover, on that very day, they ate of the produce of the land, unleavened cakes and parched grain. And the manna ceased the day after they ate of the produce of the land. And there was no longer manna for the people of Israel, but they ate of the fruit of the land of Canaan that year. So they're the verses that we're pulling stuff out of this week. And question one, what stands out to you? Just discuss these verses. This could go in any number of directions. Just pray about this. What is God pointing out to you from these verses? What stands out? What questions might you have? Go ahead and pray about that and talk about that now. Okay, so a lot of really cool stuff there. Just off the top of my head, they're in sight of the enemy while they're doing all of this. The manna stopped. For 40 years, God has been providing this manna. Now, they weren't always grateful for that. As a matter of fact, there were times when they grumbled quite a bit about it. Like, oh man, if only we could go back to Egypt, that sort of thing. But for 40 years, God has been miraculously, supernaturally sustaining them in spite of themselves. I think if we're being honest with ourselves, we can all kind of relate to that a bit. And all of a sudden it stops. So there's a lot going on in these verses. But to get a bit more specific, talking about God kind of ordering our steps here. Somebody in your group, for question 2, this is a two-parter here. Somebody in your group, first read Romans 8:28 and 29, and then answer these questions. A, what do these verses tell us about God's sovereignty? And B, what do these verses tell us about God's purpose? So God's sovereignty and God's purpose. What do you pull out of these two verses as it pertains to those things? Romans 8:28 and 8:29. Go ahead and do that now. Okay, so really neat verse, and everybody knows that God works everything together verse. Everybody knows Romans 8:28. But it definitely says that he works things together for the good of those that are called to his purpose. So he's not just going to work everything out to our comfort level or our idea of benefit. He's going to work it out according to us being obedient to him and according to his good purpose. But provided our relationship is right with him, then all things are going to work out ultimately for good, regardless of how painful or scary they may be for us in the moment. And his purpose, we see very, very clearly there in Romans 8:29. For those that he foreknew, that he predestined, his purpose is for them to be conformed to the likeness of his Son, to be like Jesus, to grow in the likeness of Christ. So there's his sovereignty, there's his purpose. So moving on to question 3, how have you worked against his purpose? Be willing to be honest about this. Be willing to be transparent, vulnerable, all of those words that I use so often in these videos. How have you worked against God's purpose of conforming you to the likeness of Jesus? Pray about that. Talk about it now. Okay, so to move to question 4, a question that we have all had in our own minds or hearts is, if God is in control of everything, why do things go so tragically or ridiculously or painfully? Why don't they go the way that I want so often? Well, a few reasons that Pastor Lynn touched on or talked about in the message on Sunday, but maybe things aren't going the way that you'd like because you don't have the same goal as God, which is for you to be conformed to the likeness of Christ. Maybe it's discipline or correction or training. So we'll focus on those two for this question. How might God be disciplining, correcting, or training you now? We can sense this in our lives often. So really pray about this, and we should all at some point be at least practicing some sort of restraint or self-discipline, and maybe there is some correction. Hopefully there's some training. But talk about this now. How, right now in your life, is God disciplining, correcting, or training you? Do that now. Okay, so for our final question, kind of some application here and an opportunity to really dig deep. We know that God works all things together for His good purpose. We know that His plans are always to prosper and never to harm. So we should be able to have a sense of God's blessing even in painful circumstances. We can see His strength being perfected in our weakness. We can see His plan sort of working out through our pain, our discomfort, our suffering. So be willing to discuss how you can or how you struggle with sensing God's blessing in painful happenings, and pray about how you might develop an even greater sense of this. So that's it. For question 5, can you sense God's blessing in painful happenings? And how might you develop an even deeper sense of this? That's it for your life group this week. Hope it's been a good one, and I will be back with you guys next week.